All right, guys, here we go into our study of Chasing Lincoln's Killer. I told you on our Zoom call that there was some pictures in the book, so I was up until the wee hours of the morning scanning pictures and putting them in a PowerPoint so you can see them as I read. So this video is going to cover the prologue and chapter 1 of Chasing Lincoln's Killer. It looked like a bad day for photographers. Terrible winds and thunderstorms had swept through Washington early that morning, dissolving the dirt streets into a sticky muck of soil and garbage. The ugly gray sky of the morning of March 4th, 1865, threatened to spoil the great day. Photographer William M. Smith was to take a historic photograph of the presidential inauguration in front of the recently completed Capitol dome. Smith framed the view from the marble statue of George Washington on the lawn to the top of the dome. The crowd crowned by the Statue of Freedom. The Statue of Freedom is the on top of the Capitol building. Abraham Lincoln had ordered work on building the Capitol dome to continue during the war as a sign that the Union would go on. Closer to the Capitol, Alexander Gardner set up his camera to photograph the inauguration. Gardner captured not only images of the president, vice president, and chief justice, but other honored guests occupying the stands. Also, the anonymous faces of hundreds of spectators who crowded the east front of the Capitol. In one photograph on the balcony above the stands, a young man with a black mustache and wearing a top hat gazes down on the president. It is the famous actor, John Wilkes Booth. Abraham Lincoln rose from his chair and walked toward the podium. He was now at the height of his power, and the Civil War was nearly won. Clouds threatened another rainstorm, but then the strangest thing happened. The clouds parted and the sun burst out, flooding the spectacle. The president's speech was brief, just 701 words. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up this nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, for his widow and his orphan, to do all which we may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So the first picture in the book, that is John Wilkes Booth. Perhaps the finest portrait of him made. He was known to be a stylish man. Okay. On April 3rd, 1865, Richmond, Virginia, capital city of the Confederate States of America, fell to Union forces. Now, it was only a matter of time before the war would finally be over. In the Union capital, emotions were high. The rebellion was almost over, and victorious North held a celebration. Children ran through the streets, waving little paper flags that read, "We celebrate the fall of Richmond." Across the country, people built bonfires, organized parades, fired guns, shot cannons, and sang patriotic songs. 4 days later, John Wilkes Booth was drinking with a friend at a saloon on Houston Street in New York City. Booth struck the bar table with his fist and regretted a lost opportunity. What an excellent chance I had. If I wished to kill the president on Inauguration Day, I was on the stand so close to him, nearly as I am to you. Crushed by the fall of Richmond, the former rebel capital, John Wilkes Booth left New York City on April 8th and returned to Washington. The news there was terrible for him. On April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee in the Army of the Northern Virginia surrendered to Union General Grant at Appomattox. Booth wandered the streets in despair. On April 10th, Abraham Lincoln appeared at a second-floor window of the Executive Mansion, as the White House was known then, to a great crowd of citizens celebrating General Lee's surrender. Lincoln did not have a prepared speech. He used humor to entertain the audience. There's Lincoln. This was photographed on the balcony that day. I lied. It was photographed March 6th, not April 10th. It says there at the bottom. But because tech wasn't what it is, it was his last photograph. So, Lincoln said, "I see you have a band of music with you. I've always thought Dixie one of the best tunes I ever heard. Our adversaries attempted to appropriate it, but I insisted yesterday we fairly captured it. I now request the band to favor me with its performance." So that doesn't necessarily make sense to you, but he's mocking the South a little bit here. On the night of April 11th, a torchlight parade of a few thousand people with bands and banners assembled on the semicircular driveway in front of the executive mansion. This time, Lincoln delivered a long speech without gloating over Union victory. He intended to prepare the people for the long task of rebuilding the South. When someone in the crowd shouted that he couldn't see the president, Lincoln's son Todd volunteered to illuminate his father. When Lincoln dropped each page of his speech on the floor, it was Todd who scooped them up. Lincoln continued, "We meet this evening not in sorrow but in gladness of heart." He described recent events and gave credit to General Grant and his officers for the successful end of the war. He also discussed his desire that black people, especially those who had served in the Union Army, be granted the right to vote. As Lincoln spoke, one observer, Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley, a free black woman standing a few steps from behind the president, remarked that the lamplight made him stand out boldly in the darkness. The perfect target. What an easy matter it would be to kill the president as he stands there. He could be shot down from the crowd, she whispered, and no one would be able to tell who fired the shot. In that crowd, standing below Lincoln, was John Wilkes Booth. He turned to his companion, David Harold, and objected to the idea that blacks and former slaves would become voting citizens. In the darkness, Booth threatened to kill Lincoln. "Now, by God, I'll put him through." As Booth left the White House grounds, he spoke to companion and co-conspirator Lewis Powell that this is the last speech he will ever give. On the evening of April 13th, Washington celebrated the end of the war with a grand illumination of the city. Public buildings and private homes glowed from candles, torches, gaslights, and fireworks. It was the most beautiful night in the history of the Capitol. John Wilkes saw all of this, the grand illumination, the crowds delirious with joy, the insults to the fallen Confederacy and her leaders. He returned to his room at the National Hotel after midnight. He could not sleep. So think about all those times in the prologue when President Lincoln was almost assassinated, or there was mention of a could-be assassination. This is just some pictures in the beginning. This is Edwin Stanton, who organized the manhunt that we'll get to in later chapters. And then this is a flag from the celebration of the fall. So one thing that I was just thinking while I was reading that, like they had a night of illumination. Think now, like on Monday, there was a thing where everybody turned their porch lights on for 20 minutes and 20 seconds to celebrate seniors. When they did something like that, this was like candlesticks and gas lamps, and like they didn't have electricity in their homes. And like the street lights were gas candles. Isn't that kind of funny? Okay, chapter 1. John Wilkes Booth awoke depressed. It was Good Friday morning, April 14th, 1865. So let's think about your characters list that you're rating. Abraham Lincoln should be an easy one to write about. John Wilkes Booth too, okay? The Confederacy was dead. His cause was lost. His dreams of glory over. He did not know that this day, after enduring more than a week of bad news, he would enjoy a stunning reversal of fortune. No, all he knew this morning when he crawled out of bed was that he could not stand another day of Union victory celebrations. Booth assumed that the day would unfold as the latest in a blur of days that had begun on April 3rd when the Confederate capital, Richmond, fell to the Union. The very next day, the tyrant, Abraham Lincoln, had visited his captive prize and had the nerve to sit behind the desk occupied by the first and last President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. Then, on April 9th at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, General Robert E. Lee and his beloved army of Northern Virginia surrendered. 2 days later, Lincoln had made a speech proposing to give blacks the right to vote, and last night, April 13th, all of Washington had celebrated with a grand illumination of the city. These days had been the worst of Booth's young life. 26 years old, impossibly vain, an extremely talented actor, and a star member of a celebrated theatrical family, John Wilkes Booth was willing to throw away fame, wealth, and a promising future for the cause of the Confederacy. He was the son of the legendary actor Junius Brutus Booth and brother Edwin Booth, one of the finest actors of his generation. Handsome and appealing, he was instantly recognizable to thousands of fans in both the North and South. His physical beauty astonished all who saw him. A fellow actor described his eyes as being like living jewels. Booth's passions included fine clothing, Southern honor, good manners, beautiful women, and the romance of lost causes. So that's a good description of Booth. On April 14th, Booth's day began in the dining room of the National Hotel where he ate breakfast. Around noon, he walked over to nearby Ford's Theater, a block from Pennsylvania Avenue, to pick up his mail. Ford's customarily accepted personal mail as a courtesy to actors. There was a letter for Booth. The same morning, a letter arrived at the theater for someone else. There had been no time to mail it, so its sender, the First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln, used the President's messenger to hand-deliver it to the owners of Ford's Theater. The mere arrival of the White House messenger told them that the President was coming to the theater tonight. Yes, the President and Mrs. Lincoln would attend this evening's performance of the popular, if silly, comedy, Our American Cousin. But the big news was that General Ulysses S. Grant was coming with them. The Lincolns had given Ford's enough advance notice for the proprietors to decorate and join together 2 theater boxes, 7 and 8, that by removal of a partition formed the President's box at the theater. By the time Booth arrived at the theater, the President's messenger had come and gone. Sometime between noon and 12:30 p.m., as he sat on the top step in the front of the entrance to Ford's Theater reading this letter, Booth heard the big news. In just 8 hours, the man who was the subject of all his hating and plotting, would stand on the very stone steps where he sat now. Of all places, Lincoln was coming here. Booth knew the layout of Ford's Theater intimately, the exact spot on 10th Street where Lincoln would step out of his carriage, the box inside the theater where the President sat when he came to a performance, the route Lincoln would walk, and the staircase he would climb to the box, the dark underground passageway beneath the stage. He knew the narrow hallway behind the stage where a back door opened to the alley, and he knew how the President's box hung directly above the stage. Though Booth had never acted in Our American Cousin, he knew it well. Its lengths, its scenes, its players, and most important, the number of actors on stage at any given moment during the performance. It was perfect. He would not have to hunt Lincoln. The President was coming to him. And I have... this is a playbill of Our American Cousin, like a program that you would get when you walked into the play that night. It was starring Laura Keene. She's important. She'll come up later. Okay. He had only 8 hours to prepare. If luck was on his side, there was enough time to carry out his plan. Whoever told Booth about the President's plan to attend the play that night had unknowingly activated in his mind an imaginary clock that began ticking down minute by minute. He would have a busy afternoon. Abraham Lincoln ate breakfast with his family and planned his day. The Lincolns' eldest son, Robert, a junior officer of General Grant's staff, was home from the war. Robert had been at the surrender at Appomattox, and his father was eager to hear the details. General Grant joined Lincoln's cabinet meeting later that day, where everyone in attendance, including Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, we saw his picture earlier, and Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, noticed Lincoln's good mood. Secretary Welles, who kept a diary, wrote that Lincoln, quote, had last night the usual dream which he had preceding nearly every great and important event of the war. Lincoln said the dream related to the water that he seemed to be in some incredible vessel, and that was moving with great speed towards an indefinite shore. He had this dream preceding the great battles of the Civil War. Lincoln had always believed in and sometimes feared the power of dreams. In 1863, while visiting Philadelphia, he sent an urgent telegram to Mary Todd Lincoln at the White House, warning of danger to their young son. "Think you better put Tad's pistol away. I had an ugly dream about him." After the cabinet meeting ended, the president followed his usual routine, receiving visits from friends and job seekers, reading his mail, catching up on paperwork. He was eager to wind up business by 3 p.m. for an appointment he had with his wife, Mary. There was something he wanted to tell her. At the theater, Henry Clay Ford wrote out some advertisement that appeared in the afternoon of the Evening Star. That was a newspaper. Lieutenant General Grant, President and Mrs. Lincoln have secured the state box at Ford's Theater tonight to witness Miss Laura Keene's American Cousin. So, like, the paper went out a couple times a day to give news. And so they put it in the newspaper that the president was coming to the play. James Ford walked to the Treasury Department a few blocks away to borrow several flags to decorate the president's box. On his way back, his arms wrapped around a bundle of brightly colored cotton and silk fabric, he bumped into Booth. They spoke briefly. Booth saw the red, white, and blue flags, further confirmation of the president's visit that night. Dr. Charles A. Leal, a 23-year-old U.S. Army surgeon, was on duty at the Armory Square Hospital in Washington when he heard that President Lincoln and General Grant would be at the performance that night. He decided to attend. Leal wanted most of all to catch a glimpse of the famous general who had won the Civil War. Charles Leal is an important person. He was a doctor, so jot that down. Booth rode over to the Kirkwood house, where he accomplished his strangest errand of the day. The Kirkwood was the residence of the new Vice President, Andrew Johnson, who was from Tennessee. The job did not include official quarters, so he lived at a hotel. Johnson's room was unguarded, and if Booth wanted to, he could have walked upstairs and knocked on the door, or worse. But he did not want to see or harm the vice president. He just wanted to leave him a note. Booth approached the front desk, wrote a brief note, and handed it to the desk clerk, who placed it in Johnson's mail slot. The message read, "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home? J. Wilkes Booth." Next, Booth visited a boarding house on H Street, a few blocks from Ford's Theater, to pay what looked like an innocent social call on the owner, Mary Surratt. She's important. Mary Surratt was a 42-year-old Maryland widow, the mother of John Harrison Surratt, a Confederate secret agent and friend of Booth's. Over the last several months, Booth had become a frequent caller at Mrs. Surratt's Washington townhouse. Tonight, her son John was not home. He was out of the city on rebel business. Mary told Booth that she was riding out that afternoon to her country tavern in Surrattsville, Maryland, several miles south of Washington. Booth asked if she would mind delivering a small package wrapped in newspaper to her tavern. Conveniently, Booth had the package with him. "There's one more thing." Booth told Mary that he would be riding out of Washington this evening. Sometime that night, he said he would stop at her tavern to pick up not only this package, but also the guns, ammunition, and other supplies that her son John had already hidden there for him. He asked Mary to tell the tavern keeper, John Lloyd, important guy on your list, to get everything ready for the actor's visit that evening. She agreed, and soon she and Louis Weichman, one of her boarders, drove down to Surrattsville by carriage. So she had this boarding house in Washington and a tavern in Maryland, and she's delivering a package and making sure that Booth has what he needs when he gets to the tavern. At some point that afternoon, Booth made the final arrangements. There were two types of preparation, practical and mental. First, the weapons. Booth chose his primary weapon, a .44 caliber single-shot muzzle-loading pistol manufactured by Henry Derringer of Philadelphia. It was a small, short-barreled, pocket-sized handgun designed for concealment, not combat. Its big .44 caliber ball, weighing at nearly an ounce, was solid a solid, deadly round. Unlike military pistols that could fire up to 6 rounds before unloading, the Derringer could be fired just once. Reloading it was a time-consuming process that called for 2 hands and more than 20 seconds. Booth knew his first shot would be his last. If he missed, he would have no time to reload. Okay, so I want to show you some images here. This was the gun that he used. It's actually on display at Ford's Theater. This is Mary Surratt, and then this is the boarding house. So boarding house was like people would come and live there and pay, not like an apartment where you had your own space, but you rented a room. And then there was like common areas and stuff for food or whatever. Booth left no explanation for why he chose the Derringer over a revolver. Pistols misfire occasionally. Either the copper percussion cap might fail to spark or the black powder in the barrel might fail to ignite because of dampness. Booth was a thrill seeker, so perhaps he wanted to increase his excitement by risking the use of a one-shot pistol. Or did he believe it more heroic, more honorable, even more gentlemanly to take his prey with a single bullet? Perhaps he preferred a stylish single shot to blazing away with a 6-shooter. Then, if he missed or failed to kill the president, he could turn his back to his backup weapon, a Rio Grande camp knife, a handsome and extremely sharp type of Bowie knife. So, he's got a one-shot pistol and a Bowie knife. Before leaving the National Hotel, Booth slid the knife and pistol into his pockets and gathered the rest of his belongings. He planned to travel late that night. In addition to the weapons and his clothing, a black felt slouch hat, black wool coat, black pants, big knee-high black leather riding boots with spurs. He took only a velvet-cased compass, keys, I'm not sure to what, a whistle, a date book, a pencil, some money, a small knife, and a few other small items, including small photographs of his 5 favorite girlfriends. When Mary Surratt and her brother arrived at the Surrattsville Tavern, tavern keeper John Lloyd wasn't there. He had left on an errand. Mary waited for him. When Lloyd returned, he parked his wagon, climbed down, and began unloading his cargo of fish and oysters. Here, this is what he probably looked like. Like, that's not his picture of the night that he killed Lincoln, but this is his style, an example of his stylish attire and fine clothes. John Wilkes Booth. Mary delivered the message to the tavern keeper. I want you to have those shooting irons ready. There will be parties here tonight who will call for them. She handed him Booth's package wrapped in newspaper. The evening callers would want this as well, she explained. And she added, give them a couple of bottles of whiskey. Her mission accomplished, Mary and Lewis drove back to Washington. Lloyd followed Mary's instructions. He carried the package upstairs, unwrapped it, and discovered Booth's binoculars. He went to a room where several weeks ago John Surratt had showed him how to hide 2 Spencer carbines between the walls. Those are guns. Lloyd retrieved them and placed them with the binoculars in his bedchamber. At the Herndon House Hotel, around the corner from Ford's at 8 p.m., Booth presided over a meeting of some conspirators. He had reunited over the previous months to strike against Lincoln. This was not the first time they had assembled to move against the president. They had failed at least once before. Beginning in 1864, Booth, the young stage star, had pledged his cash, his celebrity, and his connections in hatching a bold plan. He put together a harebrained scheme to kidnap President Lincoln, take him to Richmond, and hold him hostage for the Confederacy in an effort to help win for the war for the South. From the time of Lincoln's election in 1860, there arose several conspiracies to kidnap or murder him. Pro-secession, pro-Southern rebels began mailing death threats to Lincoln before he took office in 1861. Some even sent him jars of poisoned fruit. In one notorious plot of 1861, local rebels schemed to assassinate the president-elect when his railroad train passed through Baltimore on the way to Washington for his first inauguration. But Detective Allen Pinkerton ruined the scheme by persuading Lincoln to pass through the city in disguise several hours ahead of schedule. Other Lincoln haters threatened to assassinate him on the east front of the Capitol the moment he began to read his inaugural address. During the Civil War, several Southern military officers, as well as a handful of officials in the Confederate Secret Service, considered plots against Lincoln. But big talk was cheap in wartime Washington. As late as January of 1865, the Confederacy in danger of collapse at any moment, not one of the conspiracies resulted in a serious action against Abraham Lincoln. At some point, John Wilkes Booth came into contact with sympathetic secret agents in Canada, New York City, Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. In late 1864 and early 1865, Booth organized his own little band of conspirators loyal to him and not the Confederacy. He recruited the gang who, after he clothed and fed them, paid for their food and drink, and allowed them to enjoy the benefits of his fame and favor, would, he hoped, follow him anywhere, even into a plot to kidnap the President of the United States. Booth and his gang of conspirators, Lewis Powell, David Harold, John Harrison Surratt, and George Atzerodt, as well as Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, and others who drifted in and out of his circle, would change cheap talk into big action by capturing the president. March 17, 1865, Booth and his henchmen planned like highway robbers to ambush Lincoln's carriage at gunpoint on a deserted road as he rode home to the executive mansion. They would make Lincoln their hostage. Booth's information was incorrect, however, and Lincoln did not arrive as expected. Instead, unbelievably, while Booth and his gang lay in wait on the road on the outskirts of the city, Lincoln was giving a speech at Booth's own hotel, the National. If only the kidnapping plot had worked, there would have been no torchlight parades, no crowds serenading Lincoln at the executive mansion, no little children scampering through the streets with little paper flags with red, white, and blue stars and stripes. So here's a picture of Lincoln, or of Booth's gang. So here's John Wilkes Booth, George Atzerodt, Harold, Arnold, I can't read the bottom guy's name, sorry, O'Laughlin and Spangler. So those are all people that helped Booth. Although his panicked gang scattered after that ridiculous failure, Booth hoped to try again, but events unfolded quickly when 18 days later, Richmond fell and then General Lee surrendered. Lincoln's April 11th speech provoked more violent talk. The president's proposal for limited black citizenship and voting rights enraged the racist actor, but Booth did nothing. If he was serious about assassinating Lincoln, all he had to do was stroll over to the executive mansion, announce that the famous actor John Wilkes Booth wished to see the president, await his turn, which nearly always resulted in a private talk with Lincoln, and then shoot Lincoln at his desk. But that would have been a suicide mission. It would have been difficult to escape the White House. Incredibly, presidential security was very weak in that era, even during wartime. Almost anyone could walk into the executive mansion without being searched and request a brief meeting with the president. It was a miracle that no one had yet tried to murder Lincoln in his own office. Booth would soon turn his anger and violent talk to action. Now, April 14th, 1865, Booth assembled enough men to accomplish another mission. Booth proposed aspiring kidnapper George Atzerodt recalled that we should kill the president. It would, said Booth, be the greatest thing in the world. Tonight, at exactly 10 p.m., Booth and his henchmen would throw into chaos the Union government by killing its top leaders. That, they hoped, would incite the Confederacy to continue the war against the Union. George Atzerodt, Lewis Powell, and John Wilkes Booth would simultaneously strike and murder Vice President Johnson, Secretary of State Seward, and President Lincoln. Atzerodt's assignment was to assassinate the vice president in his room at the Kirkwood House. You must kill Johnson, Booth told him. Lewis Powell would murder Secretary of State Seward. Seward was certain to be in his bed that night recovering from a serious carriage accident. David Harold, an experienced outdoorsman, hunter, and tracker, would accompany Lewis Powell, take him to Seward's home, and guide the assassin, unfamiliar with the Capitol streets, out of the city where he would meet with Booth. Booth claimed the most notorious part of the plot for himself. He would slip into Ford's Theater and assassinate the president during the play. Powell, Harold, and Harold, Booth's two most loyal pals, agreed to the plan. Azeroth had doubts about his assignment. He would not do it, he said. Booth then threatened Azeroth, implying that he might as well kill Johnson because if he didn't, Booth would accuse him anyway and get him hanged. None of Booth's conspirators knew it, but Booth had already implicated all of them. He had entrusted a sealed envelope to a friend and fellow actor who was to see that the letter it contained was published tomorrow in the newspaper. In the letter, not only did Booth justify the triple assassination, but he signed his henchman's name to the document as well, sealing their fates. Azeroth's reluctance to kill Johnson put the whole plot at risk. Azeroth knew the details of the assassination plan that was unfolding. He left that meeting and went to the police. Booth, Powell, and Harold would be finished. Oh, if he went to the police, he'd be finished. Guards would rush to protect those threatened in the plot, and the conspirators would be hunted down. Booth would fail in his mission. At the executive mansion, the Lincolns were behind schedule. It was past 8 p.m., and they still hadn't gotten into their carriage. As the curtain rose at Ford's, the coachman and Lincoln's servant, Charles Forbes, were on top of the carriage. The Lincolns' private afternoon carriage ride and absence from the mansion had left business unfinished, with several politicians still waiting for an audience from the president. Earlier that afternoon, Lincoln was happy to be free of the politicians and the burdens of his office. It had been one of the happiest days of his life. At breakfast, son Robert told tales of Lee's surrender. For once, the cabinet meeting was free of crisis, battle news, and problems requiring the president's immediate attention. Since Lee's surrender, President Lincoln had been more cheerful than any other time during his presidency. He expected more good news about the surrender of additional Confederate armies. He wanted to ride alone with Mary on this day. She had been emotionally upset since the death of their 11-year-old son Willie in 1862. They both took the loss hard, but Abraham Lincoln recovered and Mary did not. It was hard to lose the boy, he said. He organized Willie's funeral, then threw himself into his work. Mary was at heart a kind woman, but some critics preferred to criticize her personal quirks, her expensive shopping habits, her jealous temper, rather than praise her good work for soldiers or her absolute loyalty to her husband, liberty, and the Union cause. The demands of the war had been so great that the president spent less and less time with Mary. Lincoln knew that he had to change that now that the war was ending. He wanted to talk to Mary about their future. He walked her to an open carriage, his good mood impossible to miss. Mary Todd Lincoln had noticed his recent optimism now during their afternoon carriage ride. She spoke to him about it. "Dear husband, you almost startle me by your great cheerfulness." Lincoln replied, "We must both be more cheerful in the future. Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have both been very miserable." We're almost done. During their leisurely ride, the president told his wife that they must try to be happy again, that he would like to see the Pacific Ocean, that perhaps at the end of his second term in office they would move to Chicago and he would practice law again. Freed from the troubles of war and death, he would send no more armies of young men to die. Lincoln dreamed of the future. Mary later remembered, "I never saw him so supremely cheerful. His manner was even playful." That evening, when the Lincolns finally left the great White House for Ford's, they picked up their guests. General Grant and his wife had declined Lincoln's invitation and boarded a train headed home instead. Several other couples also declined their invitation, but Major Rathburn, an Army officer, and his fiancée, Clara Harris, had accepted. At 8 p.m., the management of Ford's decided not to hold the curtains for the presidential party, and the play began without them. Soon, an employee acting as a lookout at Ford's spotted the big black carriage turning down 10th Street. It slowed to a stop beside the wooden platform in front of the theater, constructed especially to assist carriage riders in getting out of their vehicles and avoiding muddy streets. The Lincolns, Henry Rathburn, and Clara Harris exited the carriage. The chief usher escorted them through the lobby, up the winding staircase, and across the first balcony to their theater box. Abraham Lincoln's entry to Ford's Theater at 8:30 p.m. on April 14, 1865, was majestic and simple. He arrived with no crowd of guards or staff, no announcement to the audience. Before the presidential party reached the box, the actors, musicians, and theater-goers became aware of Lincoln's arrival. The actors on stage stopped performing. To the delight of the crowd, the conductor led the orchestra and hailed to the chief the traditional musical accompaniment to the entrance of the president. Dr. Charles Leal, seated in the front of the first balcony, about 40 feet from the president's box, had arrived in time to witness it all. He watched the audience rise to its feet in enthusiasm and cheer. He looked around, too, and watched as Lincoln looked upon the people he loved and acknowledged them with a solemn bow. At this supreme moment, the people cheered the man who, after a shaky start in office, learned how to command armies, brought down slavery, and became the most eloquent and moving speaker. And, as he promised he would, he had saved the Union. Lincoln stood in the box, bowed to the audience. The outpouring of emotion from the audience and the orchestra, the hissing gaslights, the packed house, the fresh, moist scent of spring in the air, the recent and happy news of from the army, all combined to make this a magical moment. And one last picture. Here is Ford's Theater, awaiting the president for his viewing of their play. So that's the prologue in chapter 1. Sorry that was super long. The next 2 chapters aren't as long.